you would have obeyed. Not because you're weak, not because you're evil, because you're human. And the most disturbing discovery in the history of behavioral science is that being human, being ordinary, decent, psychologically healthy, morally opposed to causing harm, turns out to be almost no protection at all when the right authority figure gives the right instruction in the right context. This video is not just about what happened in a laboratory at Yale University in 1961. It's not just about Nazi Germany. It's an experiment you're already inside. And the question it's asking, the one that has kept researchers and philosophers and historians awake for 60 years, is the same question you've always been too comfortable to answer honestly. If you'd been there, what would you have done? By the time this video ends, you'll have your answer. And it won't be the one you came in expecting. Let's begin with the event that started all of this. Not in a laboratory, in a courtroom in Jerusalem. April 11th, 1961. Adolf Eichmann sat behind bulletproof glass in a Jerusalem courtroom and listened to the charges against him. He was 55 years old, medium build, thinning hair, unremarkable in almost every visible respect. He'd been abducted by Israeli intelligence from Buenos Aires the previous year, where he'd been living under a false name for a decade, working at a Mercedes-Benz factory. Before that, he'd held a different position. He had been one of the primary logistical architects of the Holocaust, the man responsible for organizing the transportation of millions of Jews to extermination camps across Nazi-occupied Europe. He coordinated the trains, he arranged the schedules, he ensured the machinery of genocide ran on time. And his defense, delivered across months of testimony with a bureaucrat's precision, was this: he was just following orders. A German Jewish philosopher named Hannah Arendt covered the trial for The New Yorker. She'd fled Germany in 1933, been interned in France, escaped to America. She came to Jerusalem expecting to see a monster. What she found disturbed her far more than a monster would have. She saw, in her words, a terrifyingly normal human being, someone of average intelligence, someone without hatred or sadism as a defining characteristic, someone who had organized the deaths of millions not from ideological fervor, but from what she called sheer thoughtlessness, an almost total absence of the reflective moral engagement that might have allowed him to grasp what he was actually doing. She published her observations in a book in 1963. She called it Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. The phrase has outlasted almost everything else written about the Holocaust. Banality of evil. The idea that evil, organized, industrial, historically unprecedented evil, could be produced not by monsters, but by ordinary people engaged in ordinary bureaucratic work. That the horror might not require hatred, that it might only require compliance. A young psychologist at Yale had been following the Eichmann trial closely. His name was Stanley Milgram. He was 31 years old, recently appointed as an assistant professor, and he was asking a question that the trial had made urgent. Was this a German problem? Was there something specific to German culture, the authoritarianism, the militarism, the particular history that produced the widespread human participation in the Holocaust? Or was the capacity for this kind of obedience distributed more widely, more universally? Were Americans fundamentally different? Were you? He designed an experiment to find out. In August 1961, 3 months after the Eichmann trial began, Milgram placed an advertisement in local New Haven newspapers. He was looking for male participants aged 20 to 50 for a study of memory and learning. They would be paid $4.50 for their time, plus 50 cents for travel. They came from all walks of life: laborers, salesmen, engineers, teachers, a postal clerk, a high school biology teacher, an engineer, ordinary men from an ordinary American city responding to an ordinary advertisement. They didn't know what they were about to reveal about themselves, and neither before the results came in did Milgram. Here's the procedure. You arrive at the Yale Psychology Building. An experimenter in a grey lab coat greets you. You meet another participant, a mild-mannered, pleasant man named Wallace. You draw slips of paper to determine who will be the teacher and who will be the learner. You get teacher. Wallace gets learner. He's taken to an adjacent room, strapped into a chair, electrodes attached to his wrist. You can't see him. You're seated in front of a machine with 30 switches, clearly labeled from 15 volts to 450 volts. Above the voltage labels are verbal descriptions: slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, danger, severe shock. And at the top, the final 2 switches, simply labeled XXX. The experimenter instructs you: when Wallace answers a memory question incorrectly, you administer a shock. Each wrong answer, the voltage increases. You begin. At 75 volts, Wallace grunts. At 120 volts, he shouts that the shocks are becoming painful. At 150 volts, he demands to be released. He tells you he has a heart condition. He asks you to stop. At 270 volts, he lets out an agonized scream. At 300 volts, he bangs on the wall and stops responding to questions. The experimenter tells you an absence of response should be treated as a wrong answer. Continue. At 315 volts, the wall goes silent again. You're alone in your room with a machine and a stranger in a grey coat who tells you, in a flat, neutral voice, to continue. And here's what Milgram found. Before running the experiment, he asked 40 psychiatrists, psychologists, and behavioral scientists to predict the outcome. Their consensus? Most participants would refuse early. Perhaps 1 to 3%, the pathological fringe, the sadists, the psychologically disturbed, might reach the maximum voltage. The normal population, they agreed, would stop when the victim first indicated pain, or when he demanded release, or certainly when he screamed. The prediction was confident. It was based on everything these trained professionals believed about human nature. It was wrong. Completely, permanently, historically wrong. In the baseline condition, the standard version of the experiment as described, 65% of participants administered the maximum 450-volt shock. Not a fringe, not a minority, not the psychologically disturbed. 65%. 26 out of 40 ordinary men from an ordinary American city went all the way to XXX, while the man in the next room had gone silent in a way that was indistinguishable from death. And not one single participant had refused before the 300-volt mark. Every person in the experiment went at least that far. This is the moment to sit with. These weren't cold people. They weren't indifferent people. The observation data Milgram collected showed participants trembling, sweating, laughing nervously, not from pleasure, but from the specific, recognizable anxiety of someone caught between 2 unbearable options. Many protested verbally. Many told the experimenter they didn't want to continue. Many said they thought something was wrong. And then, when the experimenter said, "Please continue," or "It is absolutely essential that you continue," or "The experiment requires that you proceed," they proceeded. Milgram wrote about this in an essay called The Perils of Obedience. He said he set up a simple experiment to test how much pain an ordinary citizen would inflict on another person simply because he was ordered to by an experimental scientist. He called what he found one of the most important findings in the history of behavioral science, not because it was surprising that some people obeyed, because of how many, because of who. Now here's where the investigation gets deeper. Because Milgram didn't run one experiment, he ran 23 variations, and the variations told him something even more specific about the conditions that produce obedience and the conditions that break it. When the experimenter left the room and gave instructions by phone, obedience dropped from 65% to 20%. The authority was the same. The instructions were the same. The distance of 12 feet changed everything. when the experiment was moved from the prestigious Yale University building to a rundown office in Bridgeport, Connecticut, with no institutional credibility, obedience dropped to 47.5%, still nearly half, but measurably lower. When the participant could see the victim directly, could make eye contact, obedience dropped further. When the participant was asked to hold the victim's hand onto a shock plate, it dropped further still. And here's the variation that told Milgram the most. When two Confederate teachers were introduced alongside the real participant, and those Confederates refused to continue at 150 volts, when the real participant watched two other people disobey, the real participant's compliance rate dropped to 10%. The presence of two people willing to say no was enough to make 9 out of 10 participants say no too. The conditions that produced obedience were specific. They were not inevitable. The authority needed to be proximate and legitimate. The victim needed to be distant or invisible. The participant needed to be alone, without a peer model of resistance. Remove any of those conditions and the numbers changed dramatically. But here's the question the numbers don't answer, and it's the one this video has been building toward since the first sentence. How is this connected to Hitler? To Eichmann? To the Holocaust? Because Milgram's participants didn't murder anyone. They didn't know they were in a situation analogous to anything historical. They were ordinary Americans who thought they were helping with a learning study. What does a Yale psychology lab tell us about what happened in Europe between 1933 and 1945? In 1992, historian Christopher Browning published a book that answered that question with specific, documented evidence. It was called Ordinary Men, Reserve Police Battalion 101 and the Final Solution in Poland. And it is one of the most important historical documents written about the Holocaust in the decades following the war. Reserve Police Battalion 101 consisted of approximately 500 men. They were not SS officers. They were not ideological fanatics chosen for their commitment to Nazi ideology. They were middle-aged German police officers, family men, tradesmen, workers, who were drafted into auxiliary duty in occupied Poland in 1942. Their commander, before their first mass shooting at the village of Józefów, told them directly that they didn't have to participate. Anyone who felt unable to do this could step out. A handful did. Most didn't. Over the following 16 months, Reserve Police Battalion 101 participated in the direct killing of approximately 38,000 Jewish men, women, and children, and the deportation of another 45,000 to the Treblinka extermination camp. They shot people in forests, they participated in roundups, they performed actions they knew were the direct taking of innocent lives, not from behind a desk, not from a distance, not through administrative paperwork, but directly in person at close range. Browning interviewed survivors and perpetrators extensively. He identified the factors that drove these men's participation. Peer pressure, the unwillingness to appear weak or squeamish in front of colleagues. Career concerns, the implicit understanding that refusal might affect professional standing. The gradual habituation to violence, each action making the next slightly easier to perform because the moral distance had already been crossed. And alcohol, the widespread use of which by the unit during these operations is extensively documented. At the end of his book, Browning wrote a sentence that should be read in schools and parliaments and wherever people feel comfortable with their own righteousness. He asked, if the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 could become killers under such circumstances, given a clear opportunity to refuse, with no documented punishment for those who did, what group of men cannot? What group of men cannot? Milgram identified the conditions. Browning provided the historical case study. Together they point at something that is deeply uncomfortable because it is deeply specific. That the participation in atrocity at scale doesn't require monsters. It requires ordinary people placed in hierarchical systems with legitimate authority, where the victim is made distant or dehumanized, where peer culture normalizes compliance, and where the moral weight of each individual action is distributed across so many participants that no single person feels fully responsible for the outcome. Milgram called this the agentic state. The psychological shift from operating as an autonomous moral agent, someone responsible for their own actions, to operating as an agent of an external authority, someone executing instructions for which the responsibility belongs to the one giving them. He wrote that when a person enters the agentic state, they see themselves as an instrument of an external authority, not as an actor in their own right. The inhibitions against harmful action don't disappear. They get redirected, not toward protecting the victim, but toward properly executing the instruction. You stop asking, "Is this right?" and start asking, "Am I doing this correctly?" Here's the part of this experiment you're already inside. You've been in systems, workplaces, institutions, social groups, places with authority structures and hierarchies, and the subtle, continuous pressure of peer culture. You've been in situations where the person above you instructed you to do something that made you uncomfortable, something that didn't sit right. And you calculated, perhaps quickly, perhaps without fully naming what you were calculating, the cost of compliance against the cost of resistance, the professional risk, the social awkwardness, the probability of being alone in your refusal, and most of the time, you continued. Not to 450 volts, not to mass murder, but along a spectrum of compliance that Milgram's data showed is nearly universal in its early stages. The 150-volt mark, the point at which Milgram's victim first demanded to be released, first clearly expressed that this had crossed a line, was where, in Jerry Berger's 2009 partial replication of the experiment, virtually everyone continued. The first clear expression of harm, the first unambiguous signal that what you were doing was wrong, and almost everyone continued past it. That's not 1961 Americans. That's now. The 2009 replication found obedience rates statistically indistinguishable from Milgram's original findings. The world had changed. The psychology hadn't. So what does resistance look like? Because this is where the Milgram data stops being merely disturbing and becomes actually useful. The factor that reduced compliance from 65% to 10% was the presence of peers who refused. Two other people saying no. Not a lecture about ethics, not a reminder of the rules. Two people demonstrating that refusal was possible, that the social contract of the experiment could be broken, that you weren't alone in your discomfort. This is the mechanism behind every documented case of moral courage in the historical record. It rarely begins with one person standing alone against the entire system. It begins with one person making their refusal visible, creating the model that makes the next person's refusal possible, and the next person's after that. Milgram also found that physical proximity to the victim increased resistance, when you could see the person, when the harm was not abstract, but present and specific and in front of you. This is the mechanism that dehumanization exists to counter. Every system that has ever committed atrocity at scale has invested heavily in making the victim invisible, statistical, less than fully human. Because when you can see the person, when the distance collapses, the agentic state is harder to sustain. You asked at the beginning, if Hitler ordered you to kill, would you obey? Here is the honest answer that the data provides. In the conditions Milgram studied, legitimate authority, institutional setting, victim invisible, no peer model of resistance, 65% of psychologically healthy, morally ordinary people would have, at minimum, gone far further than they believed they were capable of going. Browning's historical data suggests that even given an explicit opportunity to refuse with no documented punishment for refusal, the majority of ordinary men in an ordinary unit didn't take it. But the data also shows that conditions matter more than character. That proximity to victims, the presence of peers who model resistance, and the removal of institutional legitimacy from authority all dramatically change outcomes. That the 10% who refused in Milgram's conformity variation, who saw two others say no and followed that model, were not fundamentally different people from the 65% in the baseline. they were in different conditions. Which means the question the title asked, would you obey, has an answer more specific than yes or no. The answer is, it depends on whether you're in a system designed to produce compliance, and whether anyone around you has already made their refusal visible. You didn't choose the systems you were born into. You didn't design the authority structures that shaped your instincts about compliance. But you are, right now, the only person in your social environment who knows what you know at this moment. That the conditions matter. That the peer model of resistance is the most powerful variable in the data. And that the willingness to be the person who says no first is the difference between the 65% and the 10%. We started with a bold claim. You would have obeyed. The data supports it in the conditions Milgram studied. But the data also shows what changes the outcome. And that knowledge belongs to you now, in whatever rooms you're going to walk into next.